Welcome to Comics Bazaar, the channel of comics commentary and arcana. This video features the Uncanny X-Men number 199, cover dated November 1985. So this is a very striking cover here by John Romita Jr., inking himself too, and the cover caption Born Again, and this is Rachel Summers, and we shall see how it is a preview of her taking on the name, mantle and powers of Phoenix in the interior of the comic. So let's open this one up to the splash page, and we have Cyclops, who's recently returned to the book, training in the danger room. And we have a nice little variation on the DeLuca effect here as he turns his head and lets rip with his optic blast. And the creative team is Chris Claremont, writer, John Romita Jr. and Dan Green, artists. What that means is at the time Romita Jr. was doing breakdowns and Dan Green was finishing the art, finishing it and inking it, of course. And we've got Tom Warzikowski and Rick Parker lettering the issue, and Glynis Oliver as colorist. And back in 1985, Ann Nocenti was editor. So let's open this one up to the interior story. And what is going on here is Cyclops' training in the danger room is being monitored by Moira MacTaggart and Wolverine in his brown and orange uniform. And what we learn here is that Cyclops has come to visit with Rachel, but something else is going on, and that is important X-Man business, as Moira says. And what it turns out to be is Moira is delivering the news that Professor X is dying, as she says here, to Cyclops, which he doesn't believe. And she refers to how Professor X was mugged. This was outside, or it was in Manhattan, outside the university, where he was mugged on the street. That was Uncanny X-Men issue 192. And how he has been overdoing it since being physically beaten that time, and how his body is breaking down. As she says there, all his body systems are breaking down, blood, liver, nerves, everything. And she predicts that he is on the way out, and it seems like nothing can be done. And Moira says to Scott that's probably why he brought Magneto into the school. Charlie may well intend him to take his place as teacher here. And that ultimately was Claremont's intention, and he was intent on bringing that firmly about for issue 300, when Professor X was to be killed off in a climactic battle with the Shadow King. But that's in the future, and of course it never turned out due to Claremont's abrupt departure from the X-Books in 1991. But back in 1985, Scott is aghast at the idea that Magneto would take over as headmaster of the school. He says here to me, if Charles hands this school, the X-Men and New Mutants over to Magneto, he's as good as signed our death warrants. Wolverine's more skeptical. You could be wrong, bub, says Wolverine. And then we switch back to Rachel here, who's been listening to the entire conversation. And when Scott asks, how much time does Professor X have? Moira responds, if he's lucky, he may see the birth of your child, which sets Rachel crying because, of course, in the future timeline that she comes from, she is the daughter of Jean Grey, and believes also she's the daughter of Scott Summers. So the baby on the way is not her, it is someone else, and we'll see that in upcoming issues. And then the scene switches to Washington D.C. and the home of Valerie Cooper, Special Assistant to the President of the United States on Mutant Affairs. And when she enters her house, she finds herself waiting for herself, but it turns out to be Mystique. And this is interesting because this scene is paralleled in Uncanny X-Men 265, when Val, under control of the Shadow King, goes to assassinate Mystique. And also what's going on here in terms of Mystique's taunting Val. She says, "I could be you, who's to say I'm not, and that you're the imposter." And that turns out to be the strategy that Mystique uses in order to track the Shadow King when he's in the guise of, or has possessed, the dead body of the FBI agent Jacob Rees. And also one other thing, in that video on 265, I talk about how Mike Collins doesn't draw. I think it's Mike Collins is the artist of 265, but it might be Bill Jaska. I can't remember right now. But doesn't draw Mystique with her legs under the chair. So we see here that this is the way that Mystique sits, cross-legged, and those legs were missing. But back to the comic and the review. What happens here is that Mystique has a proposition for Val, but not before transforming into, as she mocks here, perhaps a more familiar and comforting appearance, which is, of course, Ronald Reagan, President of the US in 1985, and a pretty good likeness by John Romita Jr. here. And Romita Jr. is on record as saying that he doesn't really regard himself as good at drawing likenesses, but this is pretty good of Ronald Reagan. And then Mystique has a proposition for Val, and the proposition is that she offered the services of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants to Val and the government, and rename themselves as Freedom Force, and then they become government enforcers and agents. So Val is tempted by the offer. Also, Mystique refers to the precedent of reformed villains, Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch, who were charter members of the Brotherhood, becoming Avengers, as they did in Avengers number 16 by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, 1965. So Val Cooper is tempted by the offer. A full pardon, conditional on performance. If a single member of your group breaks our agreement, you all hang. And before I pitch this to the president, I want proof you're worth the investment, a trial run, a trial foe. If you're successful, we have a deal. So what is the trial run and trial foe? It's Magneto. So they're set to capture the mutant master of magnetism, Magneto, the original founder and leader of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. So then our scene switches to a cemetery, and specifically the cemetery of St. Stephen's Chapel, Bard College, roughly 2 hours up the Hudson River from New York City, and Rachel is there visiting the grave of Jean Grey. And she also makes her way to the house of Professor and Mrs. Grey. So Professor Grey teaches at Bard College, and she enters the home when they've left. They are her grandparents, at least in her own timeline they are. And she, in their house, a house familiar from her childhood, she catches a telepathic resonance of Professor X breaking the news to Professor Grey and Mrs. Grey that their daughter Jean Grey is dead. And then we have a memory of the night that Jean fought the X-Men in Central Park, when previous to that she visited the home of her parents. This is Uncanny X-Men 136. And where she turned a plant to crystal and threatened her own parents that she could just as easily do it to them. And then Professor Grey basically disowned Jean. I deny you, I cast you out. And interesting to see here John Romita Jr.'s version of these scenes from Uncanny X-Men 136 when they were drawn by John Byrne. So clearly he was looking at that issue when he was developing his own version of the scene. And then the memory fades just as Professor Grey casts out Jean. And Rachel feels, you don't understand. When you're a telepath, you see things in people's minds, even those you love, that hurt. Mom was so powerful as Dark Phoenix, she couldn't shut that out. She was hurt to her soul, so much so that she had to hurt back. How come you loved her enough to see that in my world, but not in this one? Because in Rachel's world, Jean doesn't die on the moon, but instead resolves her battle with Dark Phoenix, with that dark side of herself. But in this timeline, of course, she committed suicide in the blue area of the moon in Uncanny X-Men 137. So then she has a memory, and this is from her when she was a baby, so it's kind of odd in terms of how she might be remembering this, but she remembers Cyclops and Jean, Scott and Jean, and Scott being worried about the future for their baby daughter. The world, I guess, he says to Jean when she asks him why he's so pensive, the world, I guess, mutants have always been outcast, but I never dreamed things would ever get this bad. Some really grim bills are being debated in Congress. They may actually be passed, Jean, and signed into law. Not the nicest or safest time to start a new life. And Jean responds, it never is. And then she says to Rachel, I want so for you to be happy. I see infinite possibilities, a second chance. You're all the hope there is, young lady. Promises yet unfilled. Be true to my faith, Rachel. Make me proud. And then what happens is Rachel is disturbed at how she tried but fought but gave in. And when we turn the page, we see what she became, a hound. And we have this horrifying memory of being leashed and pulled to heel and dehumanized by this houndmaster. When I give a command, Mutie, obey. So then she goes into Jean's bedroom and finds there the holempathic matrix crystal, which was given by Lilandra to Jean's parents, and which is said by Lilandra, this is Uncanny X-Men 138, to contain the essence of Jean Grey's personality. And in the crystal, Rachel senses thoughts, emotions, but most importantly, her presence, as she was actually, as if she was actually here. And it's at this point that she decides to become Phoenix in her own right. And she says here, they call you the Chaos Bringer. They say Phoenix was evil, that your power was too terrible to be controlled, and your human spirit too weak to withstand its temptation. I say that's wrong. I'm your daughter, firstborn and only child, and I claim the power and the name of Phoenix that are mine by right. And this is a fantastic page by John Romita Jr. here, inked of course by Dan Green. And this is the image that Romita Jr. uses for the cover and gets to ink it for himself. So a really powerful moment here. And Rachel has in mind that she now, with the impending death of Professor X, has the opportunity to become the safeguarder of mutant kind, her people. She says, my people, mutant kind, are threatened by the forces of prejudice and race hatred, just as my world is threatened by the Beyonder. I mean to safeguard them both. Once Professor Xavier is gone, there'll be no one left powerful enough to help New Mutants or protect them but me. This is my chance to balance the scales, to make up for all the bad things I did in the future and you, Mom, did in the past. And then she passes out from the transformation. And it's interesting that she's talking about race hatred and prejudice there, and this chance to redeem herself and also the Phoenix Force, and honor her mother's memory as the scene switches to Washington D.C. and another figure who Claremont was determined to write the story of his redemption, and that is Magneto. And business here goes all the way back to Uncanny X-Men 150, when Magneto was acting in the first half of that issue in classic Silver Age villain form, but at the point that he recognized that Kitty Pryde was Jewish, revealed to us, the readers, that he himself had spent time as an inmate of Auschwitz. And that began this process of developing Magneto's backstory by Claremont and exploring this theme of the X-Men comics, racial prejudice and bigotry, interestingly from the perspective of a character who would, by readers of the Silver Age X-Men, would be regarded as a two-dimensional villain, yes? So they're visiting here Kitty, Magneto, and Lee Forrester, the National Holocaust Memorial in Washington D.C. And the practice here is, at this special occasion, survivors of the Nazi death camps introduce themselves and make announcements regarding missing family members. And sometimes, as Magneto explains, there is news, and very rarely, if you're lucky, even a reunion. So Kitty also has a message to deliver. I'm here for my grandfather, Samuel Prydeman. He wanted to be here more than anything, but he died last year. He had a sister, my great aunt Chava. She lived in Warsaw before the war. He tried to find her, but there was no record anywhere. It was like she'd been erased, as if she'd never been. And it turns out that at the event, there are people who knew Kitty's aunt or great aunt, and they happen also to know Magneto, Ruth and David here. And so David gives Kitty the news that her aunt Chava spoke often of her brother in America. Rozanoff was her married name. We were in the resistance after the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. We were sent to Auschwitz. But she, unfortunately, Kitty's aunt, died there. And this is an interesting bit of Claremont's backstory development of Magneto, where the couple Ruth reveals here, that they would have died in Auschwitz if not for, as she calls him, this scoundrel. He'd been at that accursed place from the very start. He saved many of us, to which Magneto responds to by saying, "Not enough. You tried, my friend," says David. "You gave us the courage and strength to endure." And this catches Kitty by surprise. "You were a hero." And Magneto responds, "Hardly. In those days, heroism meant holding on to one's humanity, while the Nazis tried their best to turn us into animals. The way to defy them, to defeat them, was to lie, to hold on to hope, no matter what. Believe me, Kitty, I was no one special. If I am a hero, then so is every other man and woman who survived." And we do see Claremont explore Magneto's backstory in Auschwitz in an issue of Classic X-Men. If memory serves, it's either Classic X-Men number 11 or 12. But it turns out that Mystique has been listening and present all along in the guise of Lee Forrester, and she now moves to arrest Magneto. Now, Magneto responds by using his powers, of course, to wrap her up, but she's brought the renamed Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, that is Freedom Force, renamed to Freedom Force, with her to arrest Magneto, to face trial for his crimes. And a member of Freedom Force, a new member of Freedom Force, is Spiral, who has come from the Long Shot miniseries. She's a new character from that series, issue 1 of which was out around this time. So Kitty advises Magneto to leave, that there's too much risk in the center of hurting innocent people. She phases out through the floor, and in her thought balloon, she says bye-bye secret identity as she's phasing in front of everybody. And Magneto acts to save the people in the building from injury by creating a magnetic wedge to gently force them out of the building. And then basically the Freedom Force, let's call them Freedom Force now, attack him. And we're learning something about Spiral here in terms of her sorcery powers. She's tuned in to his mana, and she is discerning a pattern of power sufficient to shatter his shapings. and so her language is all that of sorcery. So Freedom Force attack together, Avalanche attacking, Pyro attacking here, and Destiny advising on the arrival of the X-Men. Colossus smashing through the wall of the Memorial Building and getting criticized by Kitty for that. Colossus, why didn't you let us phase you inside? We don't want to wreck the Memorial. So I wonder if that is a case where Romita Jr. is drawing something so that it's more action-packed and it contradicts Claremont's script. Interesting little moment here, because Colossus doesn't acknowledge what Kitty says, but he does block Pyro's fire blast, from injuring her. And what happens then is Nightcrawler is attacked by the Blob, and Cyclops and Wolverine are about to be attacked by Avalanche outside. And then what we have here is, over the course of these 2 pages, a variety of individual conflicts. Colossus versus Pyro here. We've got Kitty taking out Destiny, but Destiny doesn't mind because her own removal from the game is at hand, but it changes nothing. The outcome remains certain. So she's foreseen a successful outcome for Freedom Force. This is a nice page here where Nightcrawler gets the idea of teleporting to the top of the Washington Monument and leaving the Blob stranded there. So a nice little comic moment in the midst of all the seriousness. And then we have Rogue finally arriving and taking out Avalanche, but just as Spiral casts an energy matrix that temporarily neutralizes Magneto's power, which gives Mystique an opportunity to get the jump on Magneto and put her gun to his temple. And so the story gets resolved now in the last page, where Spiral zapped from behind by Cyclops' optic blast, and Wolverine now gets the drop on Mystique with his unpopped claws. But in the middle of all of this, it is Magneto's decision to be taken into custody. He says, "You did not see the faces of my friends when they saw me reveal my powers." That's David and Ruth. "They were terrified, as my wife Magda was so many years ago. My powers saved our lives, yet she was more afraid of them and me than of the secret police butchers who murdered our daughter. Look at what we have done to this place. Think what I would have done to the world." Calling back to X-Men #1. "I ask myself, is Mystique right? Have I become the image of those I hated? Go. This is something I must do alone. I'm through running and hiding for my own salvation and the good of humankind, or mutantkind rather. The time has come at last to take a stand, to face my accusers and my fate." So next up then is the trial of Magneto in the milestone issue number 200. So an interesting story, this one, with kind of parallel going on in terms of Rachel's decision to become Phoenix in order to become a safeguarder of mutantkind, and Magneto facing up to his past and prepared to face trial on the back of what he had done in the past, and both of them potentially looking to redeem themselves and their characters. Rachel for what she did as a Hound, and Magneto what he did as a villain, going all the way back to X-Men #1. So I do hope that you enjoyed this review of Uncanny X-Men 199. If you did, please like the video, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more content like this.